Welcome to the Green Parking Council webinar, Bicycle Parking. This presentation is part of our continuing series of informational webinars on sustainable technologies and programs in parking facilities. I am Trevor Mead, Green Parking Council Program Manager. If you encounter any technical problems during the presentation, please email me at trevor@greenparkingcouncil.org or send a chat message in the box on the left-hand side of your screen. Please enter any questions into this chat box as well. We have 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to go through the questions we received during the presentation. The webinar will run no longer than 1 hour. Bicycling offers commuters a healthy, environmentally responsible transportation choice. Today's webinar will explore how supporting this commuting option with safe, secure bicycle parking is an opportunity for our industry. The presentation will begin with a look at cycling globally and then dive into the specifics of installing a system. Our presenters will share information on the types of parking systems available, spacing requirements, revenue opportunities, and details on right-sizing a system. The webinar will then close with an example of an existing system, highlighting its costs, motivations for deployment, and the value created by its installation. Today's first presenter will be Sarah Morkos. Sarah started her career at Walker Parking Consultants in 2012 as a design architect. Nearing her 3-year anniversary at Walker, she has been involved in the architectural design of parking structures, parking and signage consulting, as well as the restoration of structures. Sarah's recent projects include the concept-level design and master planning of a 1,000-space parking structure in Saudi Arabia, architectural design for a 750-space structure in Providence, Rhode Island, design of egress reconfiguration for the MBTA's Wonderland Station, and signage and wayfinding design for a 4,000-space parking structure for the Bay Shore Mall in Ottawa, Canada. Sarah is developing bicycle parking standards and solutions to be incorporated in the design of parking structures as cities and towns face higher demands for bicycle storage. Sarah?
Thank you, Trevor. Like Trevor mentioned, my name is Sarah Morkos from Walker Parking. As an architect and a parking consultant, I've been studying bicycle commuting as a means of transportation and commuting in different cities, as well as the rising demand for safe and secure storage. Because in many cases for commuters, where to leave their bicycle is a big challenge. Well, sometimes that's not the only challenge. But here are a few examples of my personal commute to work. I live about 4 miles away from work, and I can either get to work by car or by public transportation or via bicycle. So if I take my car to work, it costs about $22 to park in the garage, and depending on the day, my commute can be as quick as 10 minutes or as long as 50 minutes. If I take public transportation, my very reliable commuter system, it costs about $4.20 a day, and on a good day, it takes about 25 minutes or upwards of 60 minutes just to get to work. This actually just happened the other day. 11 trains passed me by before I was able to get on the train because it was a game day. So some things to always keep in mind before I decide to take my bicycle to work, which always takes 25 minutes and it's free. So keeping that in mind, a lot of commuters in cities choose to take bicycles because it allows you to be outside, it's quick, and it's free. But before we delve into different ways of looking into how to implement bicycle parking and the details of it, let's look at what is happening around the world. For example, Stockholm is a city that is very popular for bicycle commuters and for bicycle riders. Their newest parking structure is 700 spaces completely for bicycles. They plan to have maintenance stations and showers. In Amsterdam, they already have a 2,500 bike parking garage, and they're working on a 7,000 space facility underwater. In Rome, they're working on creating a bike network connecting all of their major monuments in an effort to create a greener city. Tokyo, for example, has implemented what is called an eco-cycle system, which is a 200 fully automated bicycle parking garage underground that stores and returns your bike in about 13 seconds. Well, in the U.S., we're not too far behind. Many cities have implemented bike lanes, bike sharing programs, and a minimum threshold for providing bicycle parking. So how much space do you actually need? Well, that depends on what it's being used for, the kind of system, the demand, and the level of security. This is an array of possible storage systems that provide varying levels of security and protection from vandalism and weather. Generally speaking, a bicycle storage space requires about 15 square feet versus 160 for a car. With maneuvering and circulation space, we're looking at 30 square feet versus 350 for a car. Before deciding on which system is best suited for your facility, you need to first figure out how much bike storage you actually need. There are a few ways of doing that. There is looking into how many cars are being provided, and based on the number of cars, you would provide the number of bicycles. You can look at what the square footage is, and based on that, to provide the number of bicycles required, or looking at the specific use. These are all good starting points, but in order to arrive at a more accurate number, we need to evaluate a little bit further, looking into the location of the facility, proximity to urban areas, proximity to public transit, weather, and the use. This is an example on the right of a facility that is pretty close to the urban center. It's a transit facility that has several of these bicycle racks. It has a storage system that is completely separated from this, and they're all occupied, and it's overflowing. So looking at the location and the proximity and who is using it really makes a difference in how many parking spaces should be available. So once you figure out how much parking you actually need, a question may be, what is the best location to place my bicycle parking? So there are two things to look at. It depends on whether it's short-term parking or long-term parking. For short-term parking, it needs to be quick, easy to access, in and out. And for long-term parking, it needs to be secure and protected. Many require special access, but also not so far and hidden that it becomes an inconvenience to store bicycles and retrieve them. These are images of what a short-term parking facility would look like versus a long-term. So as you can see, it's close to the door. It's pretty open. You can easily store your bike and retrieve it, versus another system that requires an access key to get in and out, and it's much more secure and protected. So one idea I've been studying is to think less about how to convert a space, but think more of how a parking facility can become a shared use facility. The space on the left here can be used when there is a higher demand for bike parking, what I like to call convertible parking. So if the demand for bicycle parking is high, we convert it to bicycle parking. If the demand is low, then it's used for vehicle parking. And this could be a seasonal thing. In the summer, more bicycle riders are using their bikes versus their cars, so it could be used for that versus in the winter months. On the right, this is dead space for car parking, so this could be used for bicycle parking. Between the entry and exit at the bottom, there are a few spaces that are a little bit difficult to access and exit, so this could be used for bicycle parking. Again, depending on the demand, an entire area of the facility may be dedicated to bicycle storage. So this could be an entire section that is enclosed or open, depending on the circulation of the space, but it could be entirely dedicated for bicycle parking. The next few slides show some examples of walker projects that have incorporated bicycle parking. This project is called Patriot Ridge in Fairfax, Virginia. Here we used two different systems in secured enclosures to introduce 26 bicycle spaces without losing much vehicle parking. This example shows Suburban Hospital Parking Garage in Montgomery County, Maryland. This is a card access bicycle storage enclosure containing space for 24 bicycles. This example here is a project called WNCW Parking Structure in Wilmington, North Carolina. This here had a shared use facility providing 108 bicycle parking spaces below the ramp, as you can see from the picture here. So now, if there are no dead spaces in a parking structure, how can you convert a typical parking space into bicycle parking? Here's an example of a layout allowing for 5 U-racks holding 10 bicycles in the same space as one vehicle. Some may wonder, well, if I'm using this bicycle space instead of vehicle space, can I generate revenue? Well, different cities have different ideas about it, but in New York City, there is a requirement for every parking structure, every public parking structure to provide bicycle parking, and people have their different takes on it. These are a couple of examples of what parking operators have done with this requirement. You could have it as low as $23 a month or as high as $160 a month. It just depends on the desire to have bicycle parkers within your facility and whether it's something that you see as profitable. So deciding on what to charge is directly correlating to the demand. If you charge $200 per car, that roughly translates, based on the square footage that we talked about earlier, to $20 per bike. So it's something to think about. It's not generally implemented within the United States, but it's implemented in other areas around the world, and it's definitely something to consider once the bicycle storage becomes something that is for higher demand around the facility. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand it over now.
Thanks, Sarah. I just want to remind everybody that you can put your questions in that chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. We'll go through all of those at the end of today's presentation after our second presenter here. Our second presenter is Glenn Kurtz, and Glenn has been involved in transportation planning and management for the past 20 years with a focus on parking and transportation demand management. He is presently an executive vice president at Lanier Parking Solutions, where he is responsible for developing and marketing new services that integrate parking and TDM. Recently, Mr. Kurtz created Lanier Consulting, which focuses on parking and transportation planning for small downtowns and mixed-use developments. Glenn came to Lanier from the Perimeter Transportation Coalition, PTC, where he served as the Transportation Management Association's first executive director. During his 3 years with the PTC, Glenn developed alternative transportation programs for over 100 companies and properties. Prior to his work with the PTC, Glenn held the position of Senior Planner for the Atlanta Regional Commission's Commute Connections program, where he marketed TDM and parking management services. Glenn came to Atlanta in 1995 to manage bus and parking operations for the 1996 Olympic Games. As a resident of Atlanta's Grant Park neighborhood, Glenn serves on the board of the Atlanta Bicycle Coalition and Grant Park Conservancy. And he's also on the advisory board for the Chaston Park Conservancy, as well as the Green Parking Council. He is a 2011 Leadership Atlanta alum. Glenn?
Hello, thank you very much. I'm going to talk about a program that Lanier Parking put together. Lanier Parking Solutions is we're basically a parking management company. We manage parking operations, paid parking operations, and the such. And we've been around for about 25 years. And we've had a bit of a transition over the last couple of years in that we have been acquired by a private equity firm, and we've started to acquire other companies as well. So Linear Parking specifically is based primarily in the Southeast, and we have about 450 parking locations. And with these other brands that we have, a lot of parking companies have specializations. And Linear really specializes in the commercial Class A as well as mixed-use developments. But we do all sorts of parking, which includes hospitals and municipalities and that type of thing. But our true specialization, or really what we grew out of, I should say, is the commercial Class A environment, and then later the mixed-use environment. And this will be kind of important because the program that I've sort of put together for biking is very focused on the Class A office environment. So at Linear, we spent a lot of time thinking about sort of the people. We also think that about, but not only just from a car perspective, of a parking car perspective. We very much realize that the car is one component of a much larger transportation system, and that the deck or the parking can serve multiple purposes. And that can obviously be the car, but it also can be biking. And then we also recognize the people that are in these office buildings and other uses are pedestrians at other points, and they're using transit and that type of thing. So we're always looking for ways to not only serve the driver, and that is a majority of the people that tend to use the facilities that we manage, but all of the other people as well. And in an office building, you know, your main goal is not to park the cars and generate income off of that. It's to lease the space. So you want to really provide a service beyond the automobile, and that's kind of the unique thing that we do at Linear. So really, we're all about quick, safe, and convenient access to either the parking garage if you're driving, but more importantly, to the building itself. So in 2000, we created an alternative transportation solutions division that really looked beyond parking, and this was pretty unique in the industry from an operator's perspective back then. Basically 15 years ago, there weren't a lot of people thinking about a parking garage and how it can, or even an office building, and how people from other modes, using other modes, could get there. This was years before Donald Shoup even started talking about the efficiency of parking and some of the things that he does. So in 2000, when I came on, I was really focused on some strategic initiatives, and those included what is the Bell South Metro Plan, which was a consolidation of Bell South in Atlanta from about 300 locations to 3 locations on transit stations. So we not only provided parking at those transit stations, but also lots of other options. We spearheaded an effort for Atlanta streetcar, and today I can proudly say there's a streetcar now rolling in Atlanta. Atlantic Station is a massive mixed-use development that includes a huge shared parking garage, amongst other things. We brought Zipcar to Atlanta and car sharing through a joint venture with Linear and Zipcar. I started Linear Consulting, and my most recent project, which we're going to spend a little time on, is thinking about bike spot and bike parking primarily in commercial office buildings. In Atlanta alone, we manage probably 60 or 70 commercial office buildings, that being Linear, although there are hundreds of them here. They dot downtown and midtown. And you know, what I had sort of realized was that historically, and I'm sure Sarah can speak to this a bit, bike parking in these garages was always shoehorned in. It was always sort of like, where is there an empty space? Where can we just stick a bike rack and sort of check that box? And I mean, here's a couple examples. These are actually probably pretty nice ones. They tend to be well lit, and they're not actually in a drive aisle. But I've seen really bad examples of this, where the bike rack is even falling over or that type of thing. In addition to just seeing this and seeing bikes sort of strewn around or locked up in some sort of random places. The other thing to sort of think about is the office environment is changing, and this has really only occurred probably in the last 5 years, with millennials really sort of entering the workforce, and they're starting to sort of, office buildings that is, and developers and commercial property owners are starting to look to activate space that isn't normally activated, whether that's the lobby of the building or hallways. And so I think there's a real good opportunity for this sort of commercial bike parking need. So the other thing that I did is, when I sort of saw these sort of willy-nilly bike racks all over the place, is to think about what was going on in the United States specifically. And I did look into and saw these sort of bike stations. And I noticed, and I did some research, and I saw in D.C., and I saw some in Long Beach, and I noticed all the amenities that they were offering. And certainly when I was looking at this a year or two ago, there probably was not a need in Atlanta for this. And there may be a need now, but we're still sort of a young biking city, if you will. So, to build an entire structure like this in our downtown really didn't make sense. What was happening in Atlanta, though, was bike fix-it stations were popping up and sort of becoming a thing. And I realized that maybe we could find a way to take some pieces of the bike station and incorporate it into a Class A office building. So, bike stations have 24-hour parking. They have indoor, attended bicycle parking. They have rentals, air, retail. They have so many different amenities, and I wanted to find a way to incorporate those into the office building. So we went to one of our tenants and we said, we have this idea. What do you think about us bringing it to you? And they were open to this idea. They were doing, car sharing and electric chargers and other things, many of the things that the Green Parking Council promotes. And we agreed to put this in. So we started looking at the deck. And originally we were going to look at putting it in some car spaces. And there happened to be a really excellent sort of corner. It was wide open. It was available to pedestrians. And this is sort of what it looked like initially when we sort of found it. And what we did is we went to the property manager and we actually did a mock-up. So what you see here is kind of like, we had to sell them on it, and what this idea would be. So we kind of mocked it up, and you can see we have a little fix-it station in there and some things like that. A really important component of this was the branding as well. So instead of just sort of sticking the bike rack in the corner, but really freshening it up, changing the floor, the texture of the floor. And so we created all of these pieces. And then we also, since there weren't showers, we also partnered with the local gym in the building to offer shower-only membership. So ultimately, we actually put together sort of this, almost like a brochure for office buildings to sort of look at. And they could put in racks, lockers, tools, which is the fix-it station. They could put in, water could be handed out. And we then priced it kind of all out, and these prices were a little loose at the time. We've sort of sharpened these up since then. But they could literally choose these like a menu, and they could say, yeah, we really want the racks, but we don't want the fix-it station, or we want the fix-it station and the racks without the lockers. And we also suggested putting in 2 shared bikes as well. And since the parking manager is literally located right outside of where the station is, we thought the parking manager could manage the shared bikes and potentially the lockers as well. So that way we didn't automate it. And we don't have bike share here in Atlanta just yet either. So we kind of pieced all that together. And then we also estimated the maintenance and ongoing costs. So after some time, here to the right is Ian Hughes, who was the property manager at the time. We were able to get all the pieces together. In the end, I think the whole project cost between $10,000 and $12,000. And then, this is almost that same picture, sort of related to the mock-up. We have, short-term parking, which is on the racks, and then we put in a couple bike lockers. There's actually 4 total. The fix-it station, we added light to brighten it up, and we branded it with the bike spot, and then we also did the floor with like a little sort of garage aggregate, so you're sort of in that area. In addition, what you don't see here is we put a bench in as well so that people could change their shoes or take a break and that type of thing. And then what we've done is we've taken this and put it into sort of a brochure that we could then market to the actual building itself. So we closed down an existing bike rack that was shoehorned in the loading dock for this building, and we sort of brought it out here, and then we did a couple lobby type of events where we let people know about it. We let people know about the bike storage and the ability to rent. One of the big questions we always get is, how much are you making off the storage? How are you doing that? The storage actually has been a little slow, and so what we did for the pilot program is actually give it away for free to try to get people sort of signed up for it, with the intent down the road that if it grew, we could charge for that parking. Let's see. We had showers, we had loaner bikes, we had a fix-it station, bike lockers, and bike racks in this facility. So that is what we've done. The future vision, though, was to sort of take this, and as I'd mentioned, there's probably over 100 Class A office buildings in Midtown and downtown. And my vision ultimately is to take it and spread it to dozens of properties in Midtown and downtown that ultimately cyclists can use wherever they are, whenever they are. These are, in a sense, public facilities that are on private land. You wouldn't technically have to be a tenant. We did restrict the bike sharing to tenants only, but we actually allow access to the fix-it station and the short-term lockers to anyone that needs it. So ultimately, we could, in Atlanta or any other city for that matter, we could have an app or some type of technology that would allow people to identify where these stations are at any given time. And if we had a couple dozen, I thought that would just be a really cool sort of thing that ultimately would go beyond a single location that could serve a larger area for this need. So I think that's all I have.
Thanks, Glenn. So now we'll jump into questions and discussion here. First question we have here is, are there areas of the country where there's been a more drastic rise in bicycle commuting, and have things been done to really facilitate that and push that forward? I don't know if Sarah or you, Glenn, have an idea on some of the hot spots in terms of bicycle commuting and what those cities or locations are doing to move that forward.
Sure. So a few cities that have really taken off around the United States are San Francisco, Denver, Seattle, Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, Boston. I mean, there are a lot of cities that are generally hubs for residents that are close to city centers that also work in the city. But that doesn't mean that people outside of cities don't use bicycles as a means of transportation. A lot of people use it for what we call the last mile riders, which are commuters that ride their bicycle to a transit station for a mile, 2 miles, and then hop on some sort of transportation system to get into cities. So the cities have done various things. Most notably, cities have done bike sharing programs. They have done bike lanes or shared road systems. They've really tried to push that. But when it comes to parking, it hasn't been as popular. It's sort of just kind of slap a bicycle rack in front of the door here or add in a corner and a parking structure there. So it's not something that's very solid yet, but I think it's going to have to get there because it's only on the increase. I mean, the numbers have more than doubled in the past 5 to 10 years for bicycle commuters. It's just because of health consciousness, because of being environmentally friendly, because of so many reasons, costs. People are really turning to bicycles as a way of commuting. Also, as you might have heard or know that there's a lot of millennials that are turning back into moving to cities, so that cuts down the commute. So having a shorter commute allows bicycle commuters to use their bicycles more freely and more comfortably. So.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah. The only thing I might add to that is that I think across the board in almost every city, you're seeing an increase in bike commuting. I think Sarah was right. There are certain cities that are sort of reaching another level, similar to what we're seeing internationally. But I think Atlanta is a perfect example of a city that has increased, tenfold, it feels like. But still, when you're going from virtually nothing, it still doesn't mean you have, hundreds of people or thousands of people riding on the streets looking for bike parking and that type of thing. But with regard to the bike parking, I just want to reiterate that the parking tends to be an afterthought. The cities are definitely putting in the infrastructure, and they're bringing in bike share, but I don't know that the cities, across the board are really focused on the parking side of things.
Thanks, Glenn. Sarah, Glenn had mentioned that his program focused on Class A real estate in the downtown area. Have you come across projects in other parking verticals? Are there some where you're seeing that bicycle parking is more common than others?
Well, it really just depends on the area and the use, and a lot of public facilities have implemented bicycle parking versus private facilities.
Thanks.
Yeah, and Trevor, just one other thing on that. We do manage, municipalities and hospitals and mixed-use developments, and we're seeing a movement in that direction as well on the private side, where they're, trying to sort of stay ahead of it and be, sort of catch this trend, quote unquote, and actually are looking for ways to install more bike parking infrastructure.
Great. Next question here is, how do you deal with access to garages, looking at the gate arms for cars and things, when the deck doesn't have a separate entrance for bicycle parkers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in a lot of cases, it would require a different access point for bicycle parking. Another way of doing it is to put a shelter outside of the parking facility or incorporate it into the design for it to be accessed differently. So either through an access door or an opening that is separate, followed by an access into a gated area for bicycle parking. So it's not ideal for a single entry exit that is gated, but there are workarounds and there are ways that we're looking into developing something that would work for bicycle commuters, because the sensors for parking gates won't work for a bicycle. It's too light for it. Sometimes they don't work for motorcycles, but it's something that we're definitely studying. But for now, the best way is to separate the entrance for bicycles versus for vehicles.
Thank you.
One thing to add to that, actually, is thinking about where the bicycle parking is placed. One thing we definitely don't recommend is crossing the bicycle parkers with the vehicle parkers because putting the bicycles on ramps will cause conflicts inevitably. So the best location for it is close to the entrance, away from ramps, or maybe it doesn't need to be directly near the entrance, but not on a ramped level. So we definitely don't recommend bicycles going on vehicle ramps.
Thank you. The next question has to do with the flexible bike parking option that you mentioned earlier, Sarah. Is there any information on what it would cost to implement that?
So there are a variety of systems. I mean, that slide I showed just shows only a handful of systems that are available. It could cost something as little as a couple of $100s to something upwards of $5,000–6,000, depending on the amount of security and the shelter type. One system I like is called vertical wall rack that would be very good for a type of convertible parking, so something that is used seasonally. I like that system because it's cost effective and it's something that you don't have to remove in order to allow for vehicles to park. It could be out of the car's reach. So it's something that if you have a wall, you can mount those racks on them, and they're very minimal. They're about 5 inches by 2 feet, and so they're not very intrusive also, and can easily be swapped out. It could just be signed, this is bicycle parking or this is vehicle parking, but it really could go anywhere for the different types of systems.
Thanks, Eric. Glenn, a question for you regarding, you mentioned that there was some bicycle sharing that you were doing with the Bike Spot program. My first question is, how has the uptake been with the bicycle sharing, and is it something that all the tenants in the buildings are educated on, and what's the use been there?
Yeah, so we basically purchased 2 bikes that we made available through the parking manager's office, who is located there, during normal business hours. And the use has been not as good as I would like it to be. Certainly, during winter and summer, we see very little use at all. In the fall and the spring, we do have people take it out, but it's pretty nominal, actually. And we feel like we sort of have to consistently go into the building and educate and inform people and make people aware that it's there. It almost feels like it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. And so we're constantly trying to it almost feels like we just have to keep going and educating people. And when we do those things, we get people to sort of take advantage of it. But the use has been very, very limited.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, a specific question for you. Have you had any corporate projects with 50-year-old or older infrastructure that's integrated bicycle parking and automobile parking?
I haven't personally, but I believe someone in the company has. I can reach out and find out more detail if that's something that's desirable, but I haven't had the chance to work on something like that yet.
Next question has to do with the cost of the different, there was some mention of the cost of the different storage systems. Is there any data that's been done on the revenue potential? I know, Sarah, you mentioned that depending on the market, there's different rates, but is there any sort of analysis that you know of that's been done on what the revenue potential is in different areas of the country?
Specifically, analysis that has been done, not to my knowledge, but those examples that I showed kind of showed 2 different extremes for a requirement that the city has implemented. And more or less, one of the parking structures has chosen to make the cost for bicycle parking so high that it deters bicycle parkers from using that facility for bicycle parking. As you know, New York City is mainly valet parking, so it might make their lives a little bit harder to park bicycles versus to park vehicles or something. I'm not sure, but but the other number that was on there was about $23 a month, which is pretty reasonable. And just thinking about the amount of square footage that a bicycle parking space would take up versus the amount of parking square footage that a vehicle would take, kind of puts things into perspective, where if you're charging 25 cents an hour, which some garages do, then you might consider just having free bicycle parking, versus if you're charging $15, $20 an hour, then that's a different thing altogether. Then you can consider how much space that bicycle is taking up, and based on that, you can charge for the bicycle parking.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just add to that, when we look at pricing for parking, it's really all based on supply and demand. Primarily it's a huge factor is supply and demand. So, we also looked at maybe putting bike lockers in surface parking lots and stuff like that in areas where there's large, let's say, condominiums and things like that. We've explored ideas, and because your bike, if you're living in a 700 square foot apartment, your bike takes up a lot of space in the end, and it might be worth it to you to rent a space outside your unit. So I think there's a couple factors. One is supply and demand, but it almost, if it seems like you'd be willing to pay a little bit more for secured bike parking than non-secured bike parking. So I'm sort of thinking a little bit on the top of my head, but we've sort of played around with this, and at least in Atlanta, where there is not a huge demand for parking, for even space for that matter, unlike in New York or other cities where space is of such a huge premium, living space that is, there would seem to be more sort of demand for that type of thing, which means people would be willing to pay for it than in a market like Atlanta.
Thanks, Glenn. Our next question is, do either of you have any insights into the different operational considerations for short-term bicycle parking versus long-term?
So one thing to consider is that for bicycle parkers that are looking for a quick, easy way to park their bike, it's easy. It's not like a car. It's not something big, so you can put it on a curb and tie it to a pole, to a tree, to whatever else is available, a mailbox. But the idea for short-term bicycle parking is that it would be provided and it's easy to access and it's user-friendly. But the thing about providing short-term versus long-term is that in long-term, that's where the safety and security and protection from the elements would come in, and that's where the parking operator would provide that kind of safety for your property, your bicycle. But for short-term bicycle parking, because it could be other things besides a rack, it's really managed by the user himself or herself.
And I know that there's, systems, bike lockers that are sort of self-serve. Some of them are credit card access. Some of them have codes, that type of thing. And some of these, secured bike facilities are actual nonprofits that have staff that provide maintenance and as well as additional services. So there's much more of a operational need in those than there is, with like the Bike Spot, where it's really primarily a self-serve type of function.
Thanks, Glenn. Our next question is, are there any states or cities that have mandated minimum requirements for bicycle parking within garages?
Yes. Within parking garages, it's the one that is most popular is New York City, but generally most cities that have high demand for bicycle commuting and bicycle parking has implemented some kind of system. It ranges between 5 to 10% of vehicle parking is kind of a rule of thumb, but it's it just varies based on the location, and then it varies based on the other elements that I mentioned is to consider, based on location, based on proximity to public transit, and such things.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that. In Midtown Atlanta, we have a requirement as well. But what we're also seeing is developers are not building it into their facilities. They're still shoehorning it in. So they're building their parking garage. And I would argue that parking, in a lot of cases, parking consultants, and I'm not saying you, Sarah, but I have seen others where they're part of it. They're just building the garage for the maximum amount of parking spaces, and then they're sort of like looking for empty spaces where they can throw a bike rack in to meet the needs or the requirements of the zoning requirements. So, at least in Atlanta, and I know other cities are different, they're not programming it into the design of the building yet. So I guess we're sort of in a transition period where sometimes it's being built in, especially in cities where there's more demand, like Santa Monica and that type of thing, and then in cities like Atlanta where we're kind of not there yet, but the requirements are still there. They're just not sort of truly committed.
One final question for you, Glenn. Was there one motivating factor for your clients that deployed the bike spot that motivated them to move forward with it?
I think there was a couple. I think they saw biking is becoming more popular. There's a cycle track that was actually planned and is now exists literally outside of their building. So I think that was a big motivating factor. I think they were somewhat progressive in their thinking. They were looking for different ways to differentiate their building from a leasing perspective. So they had brought in car sharing and electric charging, and I had brought this idea to them, and they liked it. So I don't know that they would have figured it out on their own, but I think there was other factors that just made it a lot easier to sell to them.
Thanks. So before we end the presentation, I just want to open it up to both Glenn and Sarah if they have any final comments that they'd like to add.
The one thing I'd like to just mention, which was not mentioned, is the cost to build the garage, and we'll once again use this Georgia Pacific building. That garage has 2,000 parking spaces in it. It's about $12,000 on the low end to build a parking space, and we were able to build Bike Spot as a prototype for basically the cost of one parking space. And in the end, that area can accommodate 15 or 20 bikes. So, I think it's kind of a no-brainer, and I definitely think there's a movement in our cities and amongst sort of the commercial real estate world. There's a recognition that things are changing both inside the buildings and outside the buildings. And I think there's going to be a lot more of this discussion, and developers and building owners and managers sort of looking for ways to incorporate this into their properties. I think over the last couple years we saw electric charging become very, very sort of the thing to do in your building, and I think bike parking is the next big thing to do in your building if it hasn't already arrived there yet.
I completely agree. It's only going to be on the rise from this point on. It already has been, and it's going to continue to increase as people continue to move back into cities, as people continue to become more health conscious, and as bicycles are more friendly to get around. So as we use the bicycle lanes that are being provided, bicycle share programs, all of those things, it just becomes a little bit more motivating for people that were once nervous about using bicycles, especially in cities, are now becoming a lot more comfortable with it. And it's not going to be satisfying to have a bicycle storage in the basement in a corner somewhere, but it's going to need to be a little bit more accommodating. And once the demand rises, it's only inevitable for it to be something that is supplied for the user, like vehicle parking spaces or anything else for that matter.
So that's all the time we have for question and discussions today. I want to thank both Sarah and Glenn for taking the time to share their expertise with us on bicycle parking. A lot of really great information here. So tomorrow we will put this presentation up on the Green Parking Council website. A copy will be sent out to everybody that joined us today as well as others that registered. If any additional questions come up, I encourage you to reach out to Sarah or Glenn. We'll make their email addresses available on the website as well. In addition, if you have any ideas for future webinars, please send me an email at trevor@greenparkingcouncil.org. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Trevor.
Thank you.